I'm going to start by ripping out of context a little bit from your blog, and because I want to give you the opportunity to sort of defend it and give your perspective and how that's a good starting point to what you're doing currently. So you mentioned that there's no guarantees of finding truth. So I want you to kind of expound on that a little bit briefly. I know that's kind of a huge topic, but...
Well, yeah, that would be a statement of what we would call epistemic humility. So epistemology is a study of knowledge, and this would be the idea that we have to recognize our own limitations as knowers, human beings. And that means that there is no guarantee that we are going to get things right, not just in the small things in life, but even in the big existential questions. And that should be a destabilizing thought to us. I mean, it's pretty natural for us to think we've got things right. And so once you begin to wrestle with the fact that there's no guarantee that you got it right, that should just lead you back to considering your own beliefs, considering the reasons you have for them, and maybe proceeding with a little bit more care, caution, and humility as you reflect on those beliefs and interact with other people.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's great. Because I know for a lot of people that could be a complete deterrent to even trying to find truth. But I assume that's not what you're trying to get to whatsoever.
Well, it depends what a person's expectations are at the outset. So if a person thinks there have to be guarantees in life, then that could be something that would lead to, the sort of what we would call Cartesian Angst. So like Descartes, Descartes believed you have to have a certainty to ground your beliefs, and many people have that assumption. Many conservative evangelicals have a similar assumption that you've got to have some kind of certainty, some kind of guarantee that you got things right. Well, the reality is that we just don't have that. We are these limited beings. We see darkly as through a glass. And we don't have those kinds of guarantees. And I think the sooner that you get over that kind of angst, the better. And then you can get on to recognizing what we can have reasonable grounds for believing. So.
Right, cool. Because I think that a lot of people, they rely on knowing for sure. Because I don't think that's a very common view that people are willing to say, hey, this is what I believe, but that's not, I could be wrong. I don't think maybe that's just my opinion. I don't think a lot of people would be very open and willing to say that. Would you say that kind of, most people's beliefs in, I guess, their metaphysics, is that kind of where people can get caught up in having to know that there's truth instead of saying, this is what I believe in my metaphysics per se, but it's not always right?
Well, metaphysics, for those who don't know, is an area of philosophy that looks at first principles. So it looks at your most fundamental commitments about the nature of reality. And certainly that would be one area. So religious beliefs are often considered metaphysical beliefs. At least certain claims are metaphysical in nature, like the belief that there is a God who brought the world into existence. So to get those beliefs wrong, that could be pretty significant, and people would be pretty defensive of their commitments. Likewise, an atheist who believes there is no God, maybe they just believe the universe always existed, they could get pretty defensive as well about that belief. But I certainly don't think it's limited to metaphysical commitments. If you look at certain North America, the political discourse is getting increasingly hostile and polarized. Different beliefs about how to order society, what is a just society, areas like how do you define marriage, whether abortion should be legal, and all sorts of other issues, religious freedoms in society. Those are not necessarily metaphysical beliefs, but they're certainly beliefs that get people pretty fired up. And in fact, for many people, the sort of metaphysical questions don't make that much of a difference on a day-to-day basis, but some of these other less deeply philosophical questions do, because they're of more practical import in the day-to-day. So you might get people even getting more angry or aggressive or defensive about some of these other beliefs. Even sports. Debating different sports teams. It seems to me in the grand scheme of things to be something quite trivial.
Yeah.
And yet people can get pretty fired up about which is the best team and what's the best strategy to win the game.
Yeah, that's true. It's the best part of humans is our emotions, right? It can be our greatest detriment as well.
Yeah.
So I guess I want to shift gears into your blog, The Tentative Apologist, and your book, God or Godless, and just kind of your life in the scope of apologetics. And I think that kind of comes into what we were talking about earlier about how people have their metaphysics there, their more supernatural beliefs, I guess, and your role in apologetics of defending maybe specifically your own views. And so I think that comes across in your blog, obviously, the Tentative Apologist, and in your book, God or Godless. And so I guess briefly I want you to kind of introduce either of those and why you see apologetics as being an important topic.
Well, let's back up, say what is apologetics? What do I understand it to be? So apologetics comes from a Greek word to mean defense. So it's a defense, as it's often used, a defense of Christian beliefs. As people often go to 1 Peter 3:15, be prepared to give a defense for the hope you have within you, but do so with gentleness and with respect. Now, the important thing to recognize is that apologetics is not something that's limited to what Christians do or what conservative evangelical Christians do in particular, but rather this is something that everybody does. If you have a belief and it's something you accept as true and you want other people to accept it, you're going to try to make a case for it. I've already given many examples from politics, social discourse, sports teams. All of those areas are areas of debate which involve apologetics of one or another kind. So defending your particular view on who's the best sports team or what's the best way to win, how to order a society, whether gay people should be allowed to marry. Your views on that are all matters of a kind of apologetics. So this is something important, it seems to me, because dialogue, informed, reasonable dialogue in society and seeking truth is an important thing in and of itself. Now you get on to Christian apologetics. And I think, Christianity is the largest religion in the world by numbers. It's 2,000 years old. It makes some pretty extraordinary claims. I think it's well worth exploring those claims. And as one who accepts them as true, I try to make a case for it. So, I think there's really two things here. So first of all, if you believe the claim is important and you value the other person enough to want them to contemplate that claim seriously, then that's a ground to engage in apologetics. So apologetics is about valuing your own beliefs and valuing the other people that you want to share your beliefs with. Now, as the tentative apologist, keyword there being tentative, that modifier. So what I try to do is to take a particular aptitude toward apologetical discourse, which is maybe quite different from the kind that we were speaking earlier, that you maybe were familiar with at one time, that I was familiar with, which is sort of the more combative warfare type, where you get good, solid, airtight arguments and you simply steamroll people by the power of your persuasive reasoning, and then they either are converted to your position or they go away with their tail between their legs. And what I found with that approach is even if you end up winning arguments, you don't win many converts. You don't win many people over to your position. At most, people might end up thinking you're a pretty clever, arrogant jerk. And if you want to win not just arguments but people, then you need to rethink how you do apologetics. So the tentative approach is an approach of epistemic humility, again, recognizing your own limitations, recognizing you value what the other person has to share, and valuing the conversation, not just persuading people of your beliefs, but the conversation itself. Now, as for God or Godless, so that was a book I co-wrote with an atheist, John Loftus, and we took 20 different short topics and did short apologetic debates on each of those topics. In my view, the hope was to try to have the book serve as a primer for a number of topics in the big question of whether God exists, so that people can begin to think about that and have these succinct summary statements exploring those arguments as a way into the debate.
Great. Are there any things, because God or Godless is essentially, I don't want to make any grand claims, but it's kind of like just 20 mini debates, right, between, you and John Loftus. And I think, can that be, this might be a difficult question, but because debates are usually they're just like, it's essentially just a dichotomy. Like how do you work in the idea? Because I know that it's important to you, like conversation is very important to you, like empathizing and being able to have that conversation with someone. How does that work into something like that where it is kind of a very like, this is this way and this is this way, that sort of debate?
Yeah, the debate format is quite an adversarial format. And that's one of the limitations to it. And it tends to polarize people, because you really have a resolution to be resolved, arguing for the affirmative and arguing for the denial, and never the twain shall meet. And if you're arguing X and the other person is arguing not X, you can't really recognize the other person's got, or at least it's a sign of weakness in the debate format. It's a sign of weakness to recognize, hey, they got some pretty good points here because you want to win the debate. At its worst, it can become a sort of sophistry where you're simply worried about winning arguments and winning converts from the audience. And so I recognize those limitations going in. At the same time, a debate format can also be a valuable way to really fine-tune a topic of discussion and lay out some arguments in a succinct way. So long as people have realistic expectations. Probably the biggest problem with debates as they're often undertaken is a sense that simply by listening to two people talk at one another for half an hour, I'm going to have some sort of grand mastery of this issue. So when I have, see people debating, does God exist, to be resolved in 2 hours? In one sense, I want to bang my head against the wall because, people will come there and the likelihood is they'll listen with a sympathetic ear to their guy and a very not sympathetic, unsympathetic ear to the opposition, and then they'll probably go away confirmed in their opinions. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the best way to think about those debates, and the way I hope audiences would, is it is a primer to a discussion. So these are quick summary introductions to some of the major issues in this topic, like does God exist? Mm-hmm. And so hopefully people come to a book like God or Godless with those kinds of more realistic expectations.
Right. So I don't want to be too specific, but when it comes to Christians in particular, and let's say when it does come to the topic of does God exist, and someone who, like an atheist, were to walk up to that Christian and be like, hey, prove to me that God exists, should that person, because a lot of people have very personal reasons for believing in God, but they may not have the evidence per se that the atheist will want. Is that something that they should be prepared to defend, or should they just say like, hey, no, like go talk to Dr. Rauser, like he's a smart guy, he'll be able to answer that better? Is that something that they should already have, I guess, a defense for?
There's a lot in that question. If somebody comes up to you and says, you believe X, prove that X exists or something. Well, the first thing I would say, so I'm just talking about X, I'm not even talking about God, but just generally, that kind of demand is a very lofty demand because there are very few things that we can prove. But of course, in a sense, that does also beg the question, what does a person mean by proof? And typically what people mean when they use that kind of language is they want proof beyond a reasonable doubt, or even more sort of a logical proof of certainty. And those are very high expectations to present, not just to belief in God, but to most issues. I've mentioned politics, sports teams, economics, history. These are all areas where there are all sorts of positions a person can take, and yet a reasonable person could disagree with the position presented. Mm-hmm. So to demand proof of that very high standard, I think, is unreasonable, particularly when you come to something like whether God does or doesn't exist. Now, a more modest type of proof would be proof by a preponderance of the evidence, or simply just, a reasonable ground to believe something. That's more reasonable. So I think if you have a lesser sense of proof, simply to use it to mean, well, why do you hold your belief? What sort of evidence do you have? Then I can sympathize with that. That's a little bit more reasonable. So that's at the outset. What are we meaning when we ask for proof? Now, beyond that, there's also the assumption that a person holds a belief because they have evidence for it. And that would be a position that you'd call evidentialism. So the atheist might say that expect the Christian to have evidence, and that's why they hold their beliefs. Maybe there are some Christians like that, but I suspect most Christians are not evidentialists. It isn't that they get a bunch of evidence and then infer, therefore God exists based on this evidence, or Jesus is Lord based on this evidence. Rather, those beliefs are beliefs that they come to in a very basic way. It just seems to them that this is the way it is. And I think that's similar for many other beliefs that we have as well. So beliefs, like there's a position in philosophy called idealism. And the idealist denies that there is a physical world external to the mind. They believe that all that exists are minds and their conscious experience, kind of like the Matrix, right? Yeah. Well, so if you meet an idealist like that, and then they say, well, what's your evidence for believing that there's an external world? And if you try to go, well, the table's hard, that's not a good evidence, because that is also evidence that is consistent with idealism. Right. The fact, because that's just more conscious phenomena in your experience that you're identifying. Well, then you sort of realize the reason that I believe there's an external world isn't because I have some evidence for it and I infer it, Rather, my experience of the world is simply such that it produces belief that the world is external to my mind. And I think Christians have a similar experience when it comes to God.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because I think that's something that I know myself as a Christian, but I know a lot of my friends, because I go to a secular university, whether they be any religious background or any political background, they will often struggle with being able to prove something to another person, because we all have our own opinions, and that's usually our initial bias that we rarely check at the door, and so that can get us caught in a lot of conflict, I guess, rather than conversation. And I don't want you to dive too deep, because I know that you talked about a lot about it in the roundtable, but just why it's so important for you that apologetics would be more of a conversation rather than that just proving something to someone else.
Well, again, because I'm not interested in winning arguments so much as I'm interested in getting people to have a truer understanding of the way the world is. Mm-hmm. Now, that's going to involve good arguments, of course, but it is that much more important for me to present arguments in a winsome way and to be a good person along the way, right? Which I often, to be honest, I fail to do. I can still be an obnoxious jerk sometimes.
Oh, you're preaching to the choir.
Yeah, well, join the club then. So, but I think that, yeah, if I want, I mean, let's put it in these terms, if I want to be Christ-like, then that's going to involve not just winning good arguments, but being the kind of person who's the kind of person that other people want to be around. Mm-hmm. I mean, they have a magnetic personality. And when I was interested in apologetics in high school, I probably was not that magnetic personality. I was like, oh, here he comes again kind of person. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's because I value people and I value truth, so it's important.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I can't have an apologetics conversation without asking you your opinion, because I was listening to the conversation you had with Dr. William Lane Craig, and you finished off with asking him what he felt was the biggest apologetic challenge for Christians. So I want to kind of see what you're, right off the top of your head, what comes to mind as the biggest challenge for Christians.
But these days, and of course this can change, but I think these days the biggest challenge remains biblical violence. So how do we understand and process the kind of violence that you find in the Bible? So there's all sorts of it, like the genocide in Joshua 6, for example, of Jericho, Torah law that prescribes the stoning of people, the punitive amputation of a woman's hand, the story, God's mass flooding of the earth and drowning people. Today, people have a real problem with that, and it's not simply because they're victims of the modern age. There some of these depictions really are in deep conflict with some pretty fundamental moral intuitions that people have. Mm-hmm. And I think the challenge is to think, how do we understand how those texts are functioning? How do we appropriate them as communities of faith, as authoritative, inspired texts, given that there is this fundamental tension at some points with our moral intuitions? I think that's where some of the struggle is going to continue to be. But I also think there's a lot of fascinating material being produced in this area, and one of my interests is to introduce people in the Christian church and outside of it to the wider discussion of the way Christians have explored that issue.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this conversation. I really appreciate you being willing to share your knowledge and your experience, and I know I've learned a lot, and I hope that everyone else can too. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome.